It's a celebration of America's freedom. Welcome to the Marc Scaringi Show. The Marc Scaringi Show is your place for a weekly discussion on making America great again. The important political and legal issues of the day, a celebration of the Constitution, and traditional American values. Marc is a practicing attorney, a former senatorial candidate, a Donald J. Trump-endorsed delegate, and a defender of the Constitution. His goal? To put America first. And now, celebrating America's freedoms, here's attorney Marc Scaringi.
And welcome to the Marc Scaringi Show, and good afternoon to all of my listeners here on WHP 580 AM and iHeartRadio and Harrisburg 100 Facebook Live. Thanks for tuning in on this Thanksgiving weekend. This is your place on the dial, as always, for constitutional conservatism. This is where we talk about the important political and legal issues of the day from the perspective of putting America first, and we don't take a break even on Thanksgiving weekend. And I hope you had an enjoyable Thanksgiving dinner. I hope you didn't talk about politics too much. I hope you didn't argue with your family members and friends over those important political issues of the day that we discuss weekly here on the Marc Scaringi Show. And probably lots of you are out in the woods right now preparing for the opening of buck season, so good luck on the hunt. If you'd like to watch some prior podcasts of the show or read any of my columns on Penn Live or take a look at some great merchandise, including our very popular Right to Bear Arms muscle t-shirt and the We're Glad You're Our Neighbor, Just Please Don't Kill Us yard sign, go to the marcscaringishow.com website. And for more political and legal news throughout the course of the week, don't forget to follow me on Twitter, Facebook, and YouTube. And again, happy Thanksgiving, and welcome to all of our listeners. Now, to my listeners who are parents of minor children, like my wife and I suggest you take some time over this holiday weekend to explain to them the real story of the first Thanksgiving dinner, and add in the whole story of the Pilgrims coming to our country, the Mayflower, the Plymouth Colony, Governor Bradford, and all of the rest. This story of the Pilgrims is a part of the American founding story. It's part reality, part a little bit of fiction that has become the mythology of America and has come to help define the meaning of America and what it means to be an American. Yes, the United States of America was born in 1776 on July 4th, precisely when we declared our independence from Great Britain. But the history of our culture and our country reaches back to 1620 at Plymouth Rock and also to the Jamestown colony. But as we described in prior shows and in my columns, contrary to the 1619 project put on by the New York Times, the history and founding and the meaning of America is not slavery, not based upon slavery. It's based upon something very, very different. And it's important that we Americans understand the true history of our Pilgrim forefathers, not only their trials, tribulations, and triumphs, surviving the transatlantic ocean voyage in the initial few years, hacking out a life in the unforgiving wilderness of New England, but even more importantly, the manner in which they structured and governed their society. Now, this is part of the Pilgrim story that is, I fear, not being taught in our primary and secondary schools and in our colleges and universities. I know the truth about the Pilgrim's story is not being taught in public schools to my children today. When questioned, the only thing they seem to be able to tell me about the Pilgrim's story is that I shouldn't use the word Indian, and that instead I should use the word Native American. And now, I don't remember what I was taught about the Pilgrims during my school days back in the 70s and 80s, but I know I was not educated about their story in college. I was a history major at Georgetown, as we've discussed on prior shows, and a school that was once, at least purportedly, dedicated to the pursuit of truth. But by the time I got there in the early 1990s, it had been taken over by the radical left. I remember signing up for a class on colonial America, and I'll tell you, I was so excited to finally learn about the founding of America. I anticipated we would read and study the Mayflower Compact, the Constitution, the Federalist Papers, and learn about the great men of America's founding, George Washington, John Adams, Thomas Jefferson, and the others. Now, Of course, at liberal academia, that was not to be. Instead, we learned about how Christopher Columbus was a brutal enslaver who killed and enslaved the noble indigenous peoples in his greed driven pursuit for gold, and how piracy and pirates were noblemen who were worthy of our admiration and emulation because they practiced the economic principles of communism, and how that was a wonderful thing. I also learned in my history, my colonial American history class at Georgetown, of course, about slavery and evil white men. And lastly, we learned about Salem and how the Salem witch trials were just about rich, privileged men trying to snuff out women's livers by calling them witches and burning them at the stake. In short, we learned that pirates and witches were good, white men bad. Now, that's what I learned when I went to college and took a course in colonial American history. But from talking to my children, it appears that this is being taught in our primary and secondary schools today. And so that's why I started teaching my young school age children the truth about the Pilgrim's story. And the first lesson begins with that word that has become forgotten in our public schools, the word Indian. Now, my children admonish me when I use that word because they are admonished by their school teachers for using it as well. But I use that word, or I use this as an opportunity, as a teaching moment for my children, and I explain to them that the Indians or the indigenous peoples, or in short, the people who were here before the Pilgrims got here, were not Native Americans. And I know that goes against the grain of what so many of our school children are being taught in schools today. It's similar to saying America is not a nation of immigrants. It kind of grates against the ears, and it grates against our understanding and the use of terminology to describe who we are, where we've been, what we're all about. But really, the indigenous peoples that resided in this landmass that is now referred to as North America and South America, they were not Americans. So if they were not Americans, they really couldn't have been Native Americans. Well, what were they? Oh, they were whatever they called themselves. The Wampanoag, the Narragansett, the Algonquin, the Mohawk, the Shawnee, the Delaware, the Susquehannock here in central Pennsylvania, and so on. And of course, these tribes have been living in this land that had eventually become known as America. But these tribes, they didn't name it America. America's not their word, and they had nothing to do with the naming and founding of what we now refer to and call the United States of America. So how is it that we are required to refer to these indigenous peoples as Native Americans when they weren't? They didn't name it. They didn't found it. They didn't create the country, the state that's called the United States of America. But yet, if we don't refer to them as Native Americans, we are admonished as being politically incorrect, insensitive, or worse, racist. And we're going to talk more about the Pilgrims and the Indians, the indigenous peoples with whom they interacted, the meaning of Thanksgiving. When we return from this brief commercial break, you're listening to the Marc Scaringi Show.
Now, more of Marc Scaringi on News Radio WHP 580.
And welcome back to the Marc Scaringi Show. This is your place on the dial for, this is where we put America first. This is where we talk about the important political and legal issues of the day from the perspective of putting America first. And talking about that America first, we're talking about the founding of America. We're talking about the Pilgrims coming over on the Mayflower and celebrating their first Thanksgiving dinner, and how when we talk to our children at home about the importance of this holiday, we seem to get stuck right away when we are corrected by using the term Indian to describe the various tribes who came into contact with the Pilgrims there on Plymouth Rock. and how sometimes we can't even get beyond the fact that we get admonished for using what we're told is incorrect language to describe the indigenous peoples with whom the Pilgrims came into contact very early in their when they disembarked here in the New World. And the question is, the term Native American, that seems to be the politically correct term today used to describe the indigenous peoples who the Pilgrims met when they disembarked from the Mayflower. Is that the correct word, though, itself? We're told Indian is the wrong word, but is Native American the correct word? And we're going through a little bit of the history of the word Native American, and we'll shortly go into a little bit of the history of the word Indian and try to get to the bottom of this debate. But put yourself in the shoes of the Wampanoags or the Narragansetts or the Algonquins, the Mohawks, the various tribes of indigenous peoples who resided in this landmass that's now called North America. Do you think they describe themselves as Native Americans? Did Squanto? We all love Squanto. Squanto is the hero of the Thanksgiving Day story. The mythology of Squanto is that he helped the Pilgrims when they were starving during that first winter. When the Pilgrims got here late in the year, they were delayed and they couldn't get here. They didn't make it in the summer when they could have planted crops and prepared for a long, harsh winter. They got here late, and they were met by a very cold New England winter, and it was very difficult for them to make it. But Squanto came around and taught them and how to plant corn and where to fish. Would Squanto describe himself as a Native American? Let me know what you think. Call in 717-540-0580. That's 717-540-0580. I'm interested to know what you think about whether or not Squanto and the indigenous peoples who met the Pilgrims when they disembarked from the Mayflower, would they refer to themselves as Native Americans? Because we're told today in 2019 that we must call them Native Americans and not Indians. So I'd like to know what my listeners have to think about that. And also, well, the term Native American, the phrase, where do we get the American from? Is that a Wampanoag Indian word? Is it a Susquehannock Indian word, America or American? One would think it would be if it is used to describe those peoples, but obviously it's not. And I wonder if any of my listeners know where we get the term America to describe this landmass here that we all live in and enjoy. And you're welcome to call in 717-540-0580 and let me know what you think. Now, I'll give the answer, and the name America comes from the Italian navigator and explorer Amerigo Vespucci. Now, the Latin translation of his name is Americus Vespudius, and the feminine Latin is America. So this Native American, the word America, comes not from the Native Americans themselves. It comes from an Italian. It comes from a European. Vespucci was a navigator. He was a sailor. He was a cartographer. He sailed a few years after Christopher Columbus, and he's credited with discovering this landmass today that we refer to as North and South America, and that it was not the West Indies and not part of Asia, as Christopher Columbus had believed, but instead was a new landmass that didn't appear on any of the maps at the time. And Vespucci wrote about his discoveries, and a German cartographer used his name to identify this new landmass, and those maps were then produced and distributed all throughout Europe, and that's how America got its name from an Italian. an Italian sailor, adventurer. So how is it then that the tribesmen and women who resided here and had done so for millennia prior to Christopher Columbus, prior to Amerigo Vespucci coming to this new world, how is it that we are to describe them as Native Americans? And I would pose to you that that's a phrase they would not have used to describe themselves. So is it correct for us to use that term to describe them? Now, the colonists themselves who traveled from Europe across the Atlantic Ocean to settle on this landmass, they began calling themselves Americans and this landmass America. They certainly didn't call Squanto American. And in the legal documents that the colonists and their descendants wrote, they used the word America. So it was the colonists, the British settlers and colonists, who started using the word America to describe the land that they were now residing in. And when the colonies broke free from our motherland, Great Britain, they used that word to describe themselves in our Declaration of Independence. Thomas Jefferson wrote, "The unanimous declaration of the 13 United States of America." On September 9th, 1776, the Continental Congress formally declared the name of the new nation that we were creating to be the United States of America. And this replaced the term United Colonies, which had been in general use. And pretty much the rest is history. Now, our friends, the Wampanoag, the Narragansett, the Algonquin, the Mohawk, the Shawnee, the Delaware, as you can see, they were not involved in the naming of America. They didn't speak Italian or Latin or, well, some of them eventually learned English. Actually, Squanto learned English. But the Continental Congress that came up with the name United States of America was constituted with absolutely zero Indian members. The men of the Continental Congress, our founding fathers and the colonists from Europe who settled and colonized this landmass, were all Englishmen who had decided to break away from England and to form a new nation called America, in which they would now call themselves Americans. And America is unique in the annals of history. And unlike England, France, Spain, China, Japan, and other nation states, America did not evolve over centuries into what it is now. America was born at one moment in time, July 4th, 1776. And the Wampanoag, the Narragansett, and the Algonquin, and the rest, they were simply not involved in this historical endeavor in the creation of a new nation state. In fact, most of the time, they got in the way. These Indian tribes were more often the enemies rather than the friends and allies of the United States of America. So none of these members of these tribes called themselves Americans because they weren't. They were Algonquin, not American. They were Mohawk, not American. They had their own political organizations. They had their own governments, the tribes to which they belonged. They had their own customs. They had their own language. They had their own culture. To claim they are Native American instead of what they were, in a way, it kind of takes away from their own culture. It takes away from their own language, certainly. It takes away from their own political history. You know, native means a person born in a specified place. Colonists and their successors referred to themselves as Native Americans. You know, America even had a political party in its early days comprised of Americans, of course, of British ancestry, the Know-Nothings. They referred to themselves as Native Americans because they and their ancestors were born here in the country they settled and named as America. The Indians were born within their own political territories and organizations, on land inhabited by their peoples, on lands described in their own language. Not the colonists, not the Americans. And American colonists fought many wars against the Indian tribes over that very same territory and land. But they were distinct and separate political groups. And for most of the history of America, the Indians were the enemy of the American colonists and their successors. But to claim that the Indians are Native Americans, I think, is wrong. It's incorrect. I think it's insulting to them and to us. And more about this when we return from this brief commercial break. You're listening to The Marc Scaringi Show.
Let's get back to the Marc Scaringi Show on News Radio WHP 580.
And welcome back to the Marc Scaringi Show, your place on the dial for constitutional conservatism. This is where we talk about the important political and legal issues of the day from the perspective of putting America first. And happy Thanksgiving to all of my listeners. And we're talking, hopefully, you didn't get into too many political debates and disagreements during the Thanksgiving Day meal, and you survived intact with your relationships, and your family members are still friends with you and still talking with you. But we're talking about the importance of Thanksgiving and the importance of getting the story of Plymouth Rock and the Mayflower and the Pilgrim's experience here in the New World. We're talking about the importance of it in our mythology, of the origins of the American experience, the origins of America. The liberal New York Times 1619 Project would like you to think that America started in 1619 in Jamestown Colony when African slaves were brought to this new world for the first time, according to the New York Times. But that's doing a disservice to the history of our country. The 1620 is the year when the Pilgrims came into Massachusetts Bay and established the colony. And we're talking about the importance of teaching our children the real truth and the real history of our Pilgrim forefathers, and how it's hard to even get off page one because we are immediately admonished to use the word Native American instead of the word Indian or some other word to describe the indigenous peoples who were here and who interacted with our Pilgrim forefathers, and how it all automatically, from the beginning of the discussion, creates a problem with language. Who's right? Who's wrong? Is Native American the correct phrase to use, or is it the incorrect phrase to use? If you use the word Indian, are you a racist? Are you using a word that reflects your own inherent racism? Now, we all grew up using the word Indian. It wasn't until the last couple of decades when that word was determined to be verboten, and you couldn't use that word anymore. And now you have to use the term Native American, as I was admonished by my school-age children, because they're admonished by their public school teachers along the same lines. But are the indigenous peoples who were here and who met and interacted with Governor Bradford, Squanto, Captain John Smith, and the others, were they Native Americans? They certainly would not have described themselves as such. And I'm talking about how I think it's probably insulting to them to use our language, Native American, and our phraseology to describe who they were. It's an Italian word, a Latin-based word, America, that was coined by Europeans to describe this landmass. And so I would suggest to you that the term Native American is the incorrect term to use. Our children's school teachers admonish our children to call the Indians Native Americans when they were not. Why don't the school teachers admonish our children to call them what they were? The Wampanoag, the Narragansett, the Algonquin, etc., etc. I would suggest it's likely because our teachers don't know the difference between those and among those tribes and really don't care to know the difference. Although they probably know something about the historical and cultural differences between, say, the French and the Italians, they likely know nothing about the historical and cultural differences between the Wampanoag and the Narragansett. So that's why they call the French, the Italians, but the Wampanoag they call Native American. And the Narragansett they call Native American. And the Cherokee they call Native American. They lump all of these peoples together, and they use one term that's a term that was created by Europeans, and they use that term to describe these various indigenous peoples. So when you don't know the difference, you just refer to them all by the same word, Native American. So you can see how that in and of itself is insulting to the history and the culture and the traditions of these various Indian tribes. You see, when our public school teachers refer to all the different tribes occupying this land mass as Native Americans, they're engaging in the same thing we engage in when we refer to all of the same tribes as Indians. So calling them Native Americans is not treating them with dignity and respect, assuming you believe dignity and respect comes from being distinct and independent and self-governing peoples. And if you wish to treat them with dignity and respect in the choice of appellation, then refer to them or call them as they were referred and called themselves. Call them the Wampanoag, the Narragansett, the Algonquin, etc. You know, if you go on to the Cherokee Nation website today, and we're talking more and more about the Cherokee Nation and the Cherokee peoples because one of the leading contenders for the Democratic presidential primary nomination in 2020 is Elizabeth Warren, who has described herself as Cherokee. So I went on to the Cherokee Nation website, and they describe themselves as the largest tribal nation in the country. They use the word tribal. They describe themselves as the Cherokee Nation, a sovereign nation. That means it's separate and distinct from the United States of America. They don't describe themselves as American. The words Native, America, and Americans do not appear on the history or culture portion of their website. And by the way, the term Native American was coined by the United States government. It was not coined by the tribes themselves. So when you call them Native American, you're using the words of, in some of their views, that repressive, conquering colonial government, the United States government, to describe them. And by calling them Native American, you are denying their own sovereignty, national identity, and history. So I think that this whole movement to admonish individuals for not using the term Native American, I think it's wrong-headed, and I think it's doing a disservice to the truth of history and language, and it's not getting the job done in teaching our children what actually happened during this very essential period of American history. And it is a critical and essential part of American history. I'm sorry to say, it has certainly had an effect on the various tribes of indigenous peoples who were there. But Plymouth Rock and the Mayflower, that is American history. And that's the way it should be explained, and it should be taught. Now, with regard to the Pilgrims and what our school teachers teach our children about the Pilgrims, I think, actually Rush Limbaugh has an annual tradition in which he tells what he believes to be the true tale of the Pilgrim's story. And if you have a moment over the weekend, you can Google it, YouTube it, and you can hear the nationally syndicated radio talk show host, Rush Limbaugh, who appears on WHP 580. You can hear him give his account of the true Pilgrim's story. And it's rather interesting the way he presents what the truth is compared to what is the prevailing understanding of the Pilgrim's story that's taught to our school children in our public schools. We'll talk more about this when we return from this brief commercial break. You're listening to The Marc Scaringi Show.
Now back to the Marc Scaringi Show on News Radio WHP 580.
And welcome back to the Marc Scaringi Show, your place on the dial for constitutional conservatism. This is where we talk about the important political and legal issues of the day from the perspective of putting America first. And happy Thanksgiving to all of our listeners in WHP 580, iHeartRadio, Harrisburg 100 Facebook Live, and the various other Facebook Live channels we've got going. I hope you all survived your Thanksgiving dinner. Didn't eat too much. Didn't get into any political debates with friends or family. Sometimes they don't turn out the way you anticipated, and too many times hard feelings result when we should be celebrating our friends and our family, and we should be giving thanks to God for the abundance that we Americans all enjoy to this day. And we're talking about some of the terminology that gets us into trouble when we talk about the Pilgrim's story and the debate over whether we should use the word Native American to describe the indigenous peoples, the groups, or if you want to use the word tribe of peoples who interacted with the Pilgrims, and how it's hard for me to talk to my children about the founding story, the Pilgrim story, because I'm admonished I have to use the word Native American when I'm responding that I don't think that is an accurate term to describe the tribes of peoples who interacted with the Pilgrims, and how the word American is not a Wampanoag word. It's not an Algonquin word. It's not a Mohawk word. It's an Italian word. America gets its name from the Italian navigator and explorer Amerigo Vespucci. It's actually a Latin-based word. Americus was his first name in Latin, and thus the feminine is America. So it's an American word and an American phrase used to describe peoples who I'm saying, in my opinion, were not Native American. They didn't name this country. They didn't create this country. America was created as a political organization of British settlers and colonists who decided to create a new system of governance and eventually to break away from the motherland. And in legal documents and charters, they refer to themselves as the United States of America. And the Wampanoag, God bless them, were not involved in the founding, naming, or creating of the United States of Americans. So my argument is they were not Native Americans. Do you know who the Native Americans were? I would argue George Washington, John Adams, Thomas Jefferson, those men who were born in the territory they described, named, and defined as America. And we're also moving into the issue of Rush Limbaugh, who is the nationally syndicated radio talk show host who every year, as part of his annual tradition, plays this audio of the Pilgrim's story, the true tale, according to Rush Limbaugh. And in short, the Rush Limbaugh explains that the Pilgrims only survived in Plymouth Colony after abandoning the commune-style system of economy, which Rush Limbaugh refers to as communism or socialism. And they only survived once they started and transformed their system of economics and governance into a capitalist system based upon private property rights. And that's how the Pilgrims survived. It wasn't because they were propped up by the Wampanoag, but it was instead they initially struggled because they had a communist economic system and then transformed it a few years later into a capitalist-based system by agreement as dictated, as described by Governor Bradford. And so that poses the question, what do my listeners think? Did the Plymouth colony survive because it started as a communist system, then transferred into a capitalist system? Let me know what you think, 717-540-0580, or you're welcome to call in and let me know whether you think the term Native American is the correct term to use or it's the incorrect term to use. And we'll open up the phone lines and we'll hear from some of our listeners. Joe from Pembroke, you're on the Marc Scaringi Show.
Hey, Sarah Introson here, Professor.
Yeah.
I'm still showing up for class. Happy Thanksgiving.
Happy Thanksgiving to you. Oh, okay. That was just a comment. All right. Let's see. Jack from New Cumberland, you're on the Marc Scaringi Show.
How you doing, Mark?
I'm well.
Somewhere along the way, since the period of time we're talking about was predominantly European exploration, picked up the term pre-European for the names of the residents of this continent or South America, wherever. It would have been the pre-Europeans, and if you wanted to be a little more specific, we could say Algonquin, Iroquois, whatever tribe, individual tribe, put that in front of the words pre-European. So in other words, say Algonquin pre-Europeans would specifically define those people that preceded the Europeans who were Algonquin, or however you'd want to handle that. But that's a phrase I picked up somewhere along the way long ago and have been using it since.
Well, I like that phrase. I think that's it's pretty precise. It really it talks about it gives the name of the tribe, and then refers to it as a pre-European. But many of those tribes still exist to this day, and we talked about the Cherokee Nation. The Cherokee were there when the Pilgrims came into New England. The Cherokee were, of course, farther south on the continent, but they were there. But to this day, if you go on the Cherokee Nation website, when you go onto the page, their history page, their culture page, you won't see the word Native American. In fact, you don't even see the word American. You see Cherokee Nation, where they talk about their culture and their tradition and their history. And I'm just kind of postulating that I know we're always admonished to use the phrase Native American, but I don't think that hits the mark, and I think maybe it does even a disservice to those peoples. And we've gone through the tribal names, Wampanoag, Narragansett, etc. But they have their own culture, their own history, their own language, and they don't describe themselves as Native Americans. But Jack from New Cumberland, thanks for calling. Appreciate having the benefit of your views. We also have the issue that Rush Limbaugh poses every year, and I imagine many of my listeners also listen to Rush Limbaugh. And Rush Limbaugh runs, as an annual tradition, he plays an excerpt from one of his books where he talks about, he gives an alternative history to the very initial period of the Pilgrims' time in our country. And we're very familiar with the story of how the Pilgrims got into New England late in the year. They didn't have time to plant crops. It was winter, cold. It's the hard scrabble, rocky, sandy soil of New England. So it was very difficult, very unwelcoming wilderness environment for them. And how many of the Pilgrims stayed on the Mayflower, which I wasn't aware of until I started looking into this, but many of them didn't get off the boat. They stayed on the ship that was anchored in Plymouth Bay because they thought the conditions were worse on the land than they were in that ship. Could you imagine what life was like on that ship? How cold it was. Can you imagine the stench of that ship with all of those bodies, including the livestock, living there for months after months after months, and the disease that went right through that population? There's only about 102 of them that had come over on the Mayflower, and also somewhat surprising to me is only 40 of them were Pilgrims or separatists, if you will. The rest were not. And so we always think about the Mayflower and the Pilgrims, but they were it was only 40 of the 102. Now, they were the largest, I guess, block or group of individuals, and they exerted, I think, the most power because the Mayflower Compact, which was the legal document that was written on the ship before they disembarked, was really a work of the separatists or of the Pilgrims, if you will. But in any event, long story short, Rush Limbaugh said, we hear that they struggled through the winter, and they had good relationships with the Wampanoag, and the Wampanoag gave them food so that they could survive throughout the winter. And then it was the great Squanto who learned English because he was impressed by British sailors and enslaved, if you will. So that's where he learned English, and he taught the Pilgrims how to plant corn. And and interestingly, the fact that the Pilgrims, it's not like the Wampanoag had to teach the Pilgrims how to farm. The Pilgrims were British. They had been farming for a couple of millennia. They had been fishing for a couple of millennia. Yes, rest assured, the British and the Europeans knew how to fish and farm. The Indians or the Native Americans, or actually the Wampanoag, did not teach them how to fish or farm. Squanto taught them how to plant corn because corn was not in Europe, was not in Britain. It was not a plant that was indigenous to the area from which the Pilgrims came. So that's why the Pilgrims didn't know anything about corn. But corn, it doesn't grow on Rocky Top, but it did grow in New England. So that's one of the other misunderstandings about the history of the Pilgrims. And there's much more. So I'm not going to belabor the point here on today's show, but there's a lot more to the story that you really ought to take a real good look at so that you can get it right and get the founding story of America told properly. Thanks for listening, and happy Thanksgiving.